This is probably not the moment to say I came for the drinks, but so today's talk is about energy security. I should say that Neil helped choose the topic, so if you didn't like the talk later, I guess direct some of your ire at both of us afterwards. I have to start by acknowledging funders for this project who've given gracious support. This is a slightly older project that launched about 6 or 7 years ago, but we kept it going. So I'm going to kind of start with what we did back then and then move forward to some stuff that was just published in 2016 to kind of keep it very recent. But I have to say here legally that my opinions are my own. They do not represent in any way the opinions of the MacArthur Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, who I'm very thankful for their support. I should also say that based on these grants, we had 3 of those wonderful 18 books that Neil mentioned, and they're here. And if you really like the topic, you can maybe check them out of the library or get them as gifts. I guess the holidays are coming around the corner. This one was published in 2011 with MIT Press, written with my colleague Marilyn Brown, who is a geographer. This one is an edited book with, I think, 22 chapters, including a lot of contributors from the UK, as well as contributors from the International Energy Agency and the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it was published in 2010, and this one was published in 2013, which focuses a lot more on big-scale, multi-billion-dollar energy infrastructure and the pernicious challenges that happen when you're talking that mega kind of level of investment. And there, the case studies are all focused in Asia because the funder, this was funded by the Asian Security Initiative, which is the primary grant. So we did take an Asian focus initially. But this one in particular looks at 4 case studies. It looks at a hydroelectric interconnected grid in Borneo, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. It looks at a Gobi Tech array, which is a multi-gigawatt proposed plan to build solar energy in the Mongolian desert to export to China and Korea. It looks at a gas pipeline network in Asia, and it looks like an oil pipeline in the Caspian Sea, which was featured in a James Bond film. The world is not enough, so how's that for interesting cases? Anyway, I thought I would start after those obligatory slides to talk about a few things. I'd start with what is energy security. Neil talked about it as one of the 3 pillars, along with, I guess, decarbonization and equity and poverty. But there's still not much consensus as to what energy security actually is. Many people who talk about energy security go back to Daniel Yergin, and I take it some of you in this room at least know who this guy is, maybe? Pulitzer Prize-winning author, founder of a consulting group that he sold later called Cambridge Energy Research Associates. He had a really nice provocative article about 10 years ago, can't believe it's been 10 years, trying to talk about energy security in a modern world, as in moving away from Churchill and security of supply issues, converting naval ships from coal to other types of power, or from sails to coal, to what is it for the 21st century. And he said, well, if you talk about energy security, he thinks it's these 4 things. Reliable and affordable access to energy supply. So again, it's not just security of supply, it's also affordability. Diversification. He talked about different types of diversification: technological diversification, diversification spatially. Don't put all of your oil refineries in the Gulf of Mexico, so if a hurricane comes and knocks out your capacity, you're then without oil or gas. He talks about other types of diversification as well in terms of ownership and structure. And the idea there is a more diversified system is a better system in terms of resilience, accountability, performance. He talks about integration. He kind of jokes that it's really funny that he thought at the time that George Bush and others were talking about energy independence, when he said, no, it's energy interdependence. No country can be an island in this kind of globalized, very complicated world. Every country, even Saudi Arabia, imports, for instance, drill bits for oil wells or needs capital from investment banks when they embark on major projects. And then finally, he said that energy security is also about governance and information flows. That we can't forget about price signals and tariffs and time of use rates and having more aware consumers that maybe become prosumers. And I remember reading this article and being very impressed, and I agreed with all of these points. However, is there anything missing? And I mean that. If you want to raise your hand, is anything missing from these 4 points? Sustainability, okay. Also, Daniel's writing from New York, or I think Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time, which means he's lacking a perspective from the global south. So if you then switch here to Daniel Sprang, who wrote a lot with scholars from India, like Shanali Pachari, they also talked about energy security for a country like India. And here you see an entirely different set, including good job sustainability. But things like poverty, things like equity, things like energy access, things like the environment. And you can see here and there kind of historical and projected assessment of India, you can see not all of these trends are positive trends, right? The resource stocks are going down, poverty is increasing, pollution is increasing, equity, well, actually there's been new evidence suggests that it's actually even less equitable now in India than it was 10 or 15 years ago because the gap between rich and poor is getting higher and higher. So this kind of helps situate energy security. Ask two scholars, or in this case 2 and 3 scholars, you get entirely different answers as to what its core constituent parts are. And what we did at this time was well, what's the academic literature say, right? Because we have great respect for professors like Neil and others at UCL. What are they writing about when they write these articles in journals that everyone can't wait to read? And we found then, still 80% of articles did really focus on energy security as simply availability, or security of supply, SOS, if you want the kind of acronym thrown around a lot. About half of the articles touched on things like affordability, but only about a third started talking about things like efficiency or innovation, and only about a quarter were talking about sustainability issues. Not just climate change, pollution, water, land use change. So we have some problems as well within the literature. They don't define energy security consistently. Many of them are very narrow in their focus, focusing on a sector or a single country like Russia or the US, or a technology like nuclear security or coal security. There was little attempt to look across energy security dimensions. There was little attempt to actually collect data from experts or users or consumers or politicians or investors, any type of stakeholder about what it was. And also there was little attempts to kind of made to measure and track performance. And so one of the first things we did after this lit review is we did develop a very simple energy security index. We were able to luckily get it past peer review, publish it in annual review. And the kind of thing there is we focus on the OECD, that's rich countries, so the UK was included in the sample. It's Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Here are the countries. We looked at them very simply, how are they doing on a limited set of metrics across a few dimensions of energy security, so things like dependence and diversification, consumption, prices, and pollution. These are just the numbers for 1970, and these are the numbers for 2007, and then we said, okay, we'll give you a scoring technique. You can have one of 3 scores. 0 if it stayed the same, +1 if it improved, and -1 if it didn't. This is what happens when you put a qualitative researcher in charge of quantitative analysis. Extremely simple. And then you get these results. Over those 2 time points, on those different metrics, countries in green improved. Countries here stagnated. And all of these countries saw declining trends. And we found this shocking, predominantly because if you ask anyone, or almost anyone, since the 1970s, think of how much we've done. We've diversified away from oil for electricity after the OPEC embargo. We created the International Energy Agency. We've started promoting efficiency in renewables. We've had renewable portfolio standards, tariffs, taxes, carbon taxes, time of use rates, all sorts of stuff. And yet energy security has deteriorated among these different types of countries. The other thing we did is we did many case studies of the top performer and the worst performer. And just to kind of give you a taste for why these countries are doing well or poorly. In Denmark, who was at that time the most secure, we argued, they were able to transition from complete dependence to complete self-sufficiency. Now, unfortunately for Denmark, a few years ago that switched in about 2013 because their oil in the North Sea has started to run out. But at that time, that's a pretty massive shift. 99% dependent on imported oil to a net self-sufficient country that exports oil and gas on the market. At that time, they heavily invested in wind. They have had progressive taxation, carbon pollution taxes going back decades. They also, unfortunately, even they still have some negative elements of energy security, really high prices. At the time, the highest in the EU for electricity, and was it the 4th highest within Europe, and still above half in terms of petrol. So in other words, they were able to accomplish a lot of stuff, but it ended up costing ratepayers. Spain, conversely, has kind of seen a checklist of disaster. Really worsening energy intensity. They were one of only 3 countries in the entire sample to see energy efficiency not improve since 1970. And again, think of all the improvements to manufacturing, think of all the improvements, residential efficiency, commercial efficiency gains, energy audits, retrofits, all of that. You're not supposed to see energy intensity go the wrong way. They still are dependent on imports. They have limited input to the policymaking and planning process. They put a lot of money into nuclear that they then withdrew. So it was even worse. They invested in nuclear and then didn't build it. And finally, it's this weird situation where a lot of Spanish energy companies actually reinvest proceeds overseas to markets like South America for rapid more rates of return and leave national infrastructure kind of degraded. Right, so that's kind of, if you really wanted to kind of, by the book, do it poorly, we argued at the time that Spain was a good example. However, despite the strength of that paper, there are still some problems. First of all, we didn't include all of these different dimensions that could exist for energy security. Where's equity, which Neil mentioned? Where's governance? Where's water? Where's competition? Trade? Where's resilience? Adaptive capacity to shocks, disasters, climate change. Notice that we had no metrics related to nuclear power, or we had no metrics related to energy access for countries like India or China. We only had 2 data points. We only had a limited number of metrics. We only did OECD, right, which is only, at that time, 22 countries in 1970. There are almost 200 countries now. We had a very simple scoring technique with a limited literature review. And so we embarked on this massive project funded by MacArthur and Rockefeller. And so to get a start, we did interviews with experts, and we would call these elite interviews. They're with people who were at vice presidents or presidents of utilities. We talked to the chief economist at BP and the chief economist at Shell. We talked to the Secretary of Energy at the US. I really burned a lot of my social capital doing these types of interviews. We also did a survey to experts. Had we known about Neil or Taj, we would have asked them back then, but we didn't. We sent surveys to people like Amory Lovins, who is well known in the energy field, Art Rosenfeld, Lee Shipper, who passed away a few years back. Basically people who had a lot of citations and articles and books on the topic. We then had a workshop in Singapore, and if you have really good eyes, you'll see a really thin and much more full hair on me. We invited people from the IEA and EASA and the IAEA and a variety of other communities to come, and we also complemented that with invitations from the developing world, from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, from TERI in India, from places, I think we even had someone from Kenya and someone from Tanzania. And we had a 3-day intensive workshop where we really discussed energy security as a topic. And then we rounded it out with a literature review of the top energy journals for the past 5 years. And we actually had a 5th thing, which I'm not going to talk about because I only have 45 minutes. We also did a series of surveys later on to get the perspective from end users and consumers. But that's a whole other track of literature I'm not going to talk about today. So for the 4 main methods I will talk about, which is the elite interviews, the survey, the workshop, and the lit review, we were really looking to answer these 3 questions. What is energy security? What components constitute its dimensions? Is it affordability? Is it efficiency? Is it resilience? Is it governance? And then finally, if we had to measure it, what metrics best capture those components? And our results got complex really quickly. This was an open-ended discussion for the interviews, and the interviews alone, which we published here, still gave us 320 simple indicators and 52 complex indicators. And you may be asking, what in the world are simple or complex indicators? The idea is here. You have very basic indicators, like consumption. You have kind of intermediate indicators, things like energy intensity, which is the amount of energy you use per economic output. And then you have very complex indicators. Things like the IEA runs a scorecard of national performance and sustainable development, the ESI index, which is, I think, 4 indicators that are kind of aggregated together. So our idea was we didn't want to exclude any, so we included all different types of indicators. And again, this is actually from that paper. You can see we just listed out dimensions, components, the indicators that everyone mentioned, both simple and complex. And so our idea there was, well, hypothetically, if you wanted to create an index, here's the material you could work with, grounded in our interviews and the survey with elites and experts. But that doesn't really get us that far with how do you integrate them all. And so then we had discussions with these interviewee respondents about what they thought would make a good index. And again, I won't get into too much detail. The idea was it needed to be simple, relevant, reliable, balanced, verifiable, available, and comprehensive, which was a challenge, juggling all of these different components, because usually if you go too far in simplicity, well, you're not being very comprehensive. And if you go too far with reliability, well, then it starts to get really, really difficult for policymakers to understand what the heck you're doing. It becomes too complex. So our final results after going through this process, especially the workshop, was that energy security, at least for these respondents, consisted of 5 dimensions. And you could correlate these dimensions with different components and metrics. And the dimensions are availability, things like security of supply, self-sufficiency, and diversification. Affordability, not just stability of prices, but also access and equity issues, as well as predictable prices. Because even if prices are low, if they're volatile, it's very hard to make investments or to project future kind of trends. Efficiency and innovation was third. Things like research intensity, energy intensity, safety and reliability, how many blackouts do they have, how many accidents do they have, how fast are they tapping into their stockpiles from a resilience standpoint. Sustainability, and again, this was very broad. Land use, water, climate, and pollution were all considered energy security concerns. And I can say here, I promised I wouldn't talk about it, but I'll just sneak it in. For our survey, in some countries, water was ranked the single most important energy security concern, right? And so things like water and air are not peripheral to an energy security discussion, at least for many countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore, which I think were the 4 where water was listed at the top. And then finally, regulation and governance. How well are these countries doing in terms of corruption, regulatory quality, rule of law, about exports and trade? What about subsidies, per capita subsidies? And what about information? How complete could we make our collection of data based on what was available back when we did the study? So that was our framework. We then took a year. Getting data was really hard because we were looking at a lot of Asian countries like Laos, Cambodia, et cetera. We actually had to go to Phnom Penh and Vientiane and Laos and sit with the ministry and try to sift through data. So issues of data quality were really challenging. Then we had to do data analysis. So we coded the data. We made it all the same direction. So it was easy to see trends. We also scored a much more comprehensive way. We didn't just do the 3 scoring technique of 0, 1, and +1 or -1. We had a score of 0 to 100, and we made it relative. So the best performer got 100, and the worst performer got a 0, and everyone else fell in between. The idea was it was kind of comparative rather than absolute. And I think, yeah, here just gives you a sense. So this would be the actual data. I can't believe I fit it on the slide, but here's the actual data for, I don't even have the year on this. I think this, let's just pretend it's 1970. That's not the point. But here's the data, and you can see it gets converted to a score of 0 to 100. And so the idea here is the 100 is the best performer and the 0 is the worst performer in class. So it really is a hyper-comparative approach to what energy security is. So what are our results? After scratching our heads, sitting on this data for more than a year, and published here in Energy and Ecological Economics. The first is, interestingly, this shows you if you just take absolute performance on all of our metrics over the entire period studied. And for this study, it was 1990 to 2010. So we've got 20 years. You can see that Japan, ironically, a year before Fukushima, was most secure. And countries like Myanmar, India, and Vietnam were least secure. We had the US and the EU, New Zealand and Australia in here. New Zealand and Australia because they were pretty large trading partners with the Asian countries. And the USA and the EU as a benchmark because most scholars at the time probably considered them at the lead of energy security issues and trends. Of course, the US and the EU know what energy security is and are probably doing well. And it's interesting that the EU actually did not perform as well as Brunei, for instance, but they still did relatively well. Another way you can use our index is to look at not just absolute security, but who improved and who didn't. And this shows you most improved to least improved over the 20-year period. And again, here, interestingly, the EU slides, right? They haven't really progressed that much at all. And again, they've actually degressed just a little bit because the score is below 0. A score above 0 means positive improvement, and a score in the negatives means they actually saw significant deterioration, like Myanmar Laos, and Cambodia. And again, the short answer for why Malaysia and Australia succeeded the most, we did some case studies there, is just large resource endowments they happen to capitalize on and very aggressive plans, at least in Malaysia, for electrification and palm oil production. So they scored really well on a lot of our metrics. They didn't score so well on things like subsidies or affordability, but in a lot of the other areas they did score very well. So what does all of this mean? Coming back now to London a few years later. First is, interestingly, even the best performer at that time, Japan, did not score as well as they could have, right? They scored about 280, when the best score they could have had was 500. And remember, our scoring technique was cross-comparative, so we were only comparing how well Japan does against other countries. The idea here is no single country excels in all energy security areas. And in fact, what's more likely is trade-offs. And I hinted at this earlier when I showed you Denmark as a success, but even Denmark still saw troubling increases in things like prices or consumption. Right, so this starts to get really tricky because it suggests that sometimes energy security is like Sophie's choice or a poison chalice. You enhance elements in one dimension only by hurting elements in another dimension. The other thing that we try to argue for is a broadening of energy security as a discussive point. It's not just about supply, it's not just about prices, which still dominates a lot of the literature. It's also about things like governance, things like pollution, things like water, things like innovation and subsidies. All of this matters, according to our respondents at least, from an energy security perspective. Our approach looks mostly at national performance, but that's not the only scale, and I'll talk about this in a bit when I talk about gaps. What about household security? What about city security? What about regional security? And then finally, why isn't the EU improving more, right? Because from 1990 to 2010, I mean, you would guess the EU really started to push their energy vision. We started to see Germany's transition take root. We saw Denmark and other countries like Norway really promote diversification and reinvestments in energy. So why? I mean, is it just because they were already doing well, so there was less area to improve? Or is it things like dependence on Russia has gotten a lot more significant? The question mark there implies I actually don't know. So maybe that's something we can discuss. Moving away from that, we've done work more recently that I think is even more relevant for the UK. We did a piece in 2014 that tried to talk about the complexity of trade-offs. We wanted to illustrate trade-offs in practice. And this was at the Asian Development Bank. They had a workshop within the energy security community. And we decided to take 5 pretty good energy security goals: self-sufficiency, affordability, universal access, mitigating climate change, and water. We were also doing some work at that time on the energy-water nexus. And I'm amazed, by the way, I don't know the numbers for the EU, but in both the US and France, electricity uses more water than any other sector. And I'm saying use, not consume. Use means withdrawal and often return to the source. So it's consumption as well as withdrawals. But the idea that energy systems are so intertwined with water in a situation where the UN is predicting water scarcity and water stress in 3/4 of the globe by 2030 is very scary. Shale gas needs water. Wind energy even needs water. Even solar needs water when you have to wipe and maintain systems, especially CSP needs large amounts of water. So we included a water scenario. And what was really troubling, again, was all of the packages conflicted in terms of optimal approach as well as benefits and costs. And so a really good example would be, let's say you were focusing on enhancing self-sufficiency. That means using domestic resources. Maybe those resources are tar sands or thorium. That could be really expensive. So it trades off with your affordability. Maybe another one is looking at water and climate. And here, nuclear is a huge issue. From a climate standpoint, it has minimal emissions across its life cycle compared to fossil fuels. From a water standpoint, it's the most water-intensive source of electricity, period. So again, you start to see real tough, pernicious trade-offs that conflict and conflate energy security goals. And the idea here is that, troublingly, no policy package achieves all dimensions of energy security. And if you did want a country that tried to have all 5, self-sufficiency, affordability, universal access, low carbon, and water, you couldn't do it. It is not possible with existing resources and technologies. Finally, and most recently, I've partnered up with Marilyn and her PhD student, Yu Wang, who do principal component analysis and regression analysis to really get into a lot of our data from the index that goes beyond my simple 0 to 100 scoring technique. And here they use z-scores, which really are talking about differences in terms of standard deviation. And here we updated this to 2010 for the rest of the EU countries. And you can see UK should be here somewhere, yes. So the idea here is the US was low in its energy security in both 1970 and today. They didn't do so well. Whereas a country like Austria has been high. And it's kind of countries that move up over here to 2010 that improve. And you can see the UK is doing pretty well relative to the other countries in the OECD. You can also see it here in terms of kind of most to least improved. And again, the UK is not doing so bad. At least it's above 0 in terms of what it improved, as well as Canada, Belgium, and the US. And you can see countries like Turkey and Ireland are not doing so well. And again, Denmark is starting to slide because a lot of those issues of affordability and consumption are coming into play, as well as declining reserve to production ratios for oil and gas. So they lost their self-sufficiency edge around this time. The final thing you can start to do is you can start to cluster countries together with similar energy security concerns. This is the kind of old story, misery loves company. So if countries have similar challenges, maybe they can band together towards addressing them. And what's interesting here is we put the UK in the same cluster as Denmark and Norway. They've seen things like improved availability and efficiency, but definitely at the expense of affordability. And here, fuel poverty, right, in the UK comes to mind as a very pressing concern. You have others in this cluster that have seen availability and affordability increase together, and you have others, cluster 3, which we didn't really know what. There was like no discernible trend, so we kind of put them in the other. So I think this kind of notion of clustering and commonalities is also very interesting from a quantitative standpoint. So what are the gaps? That was 6 years of research summed up in how am I doing on time? Perfect. 25 minutes of time. So what's left? What is there left to do? What gaps or lacunae exist within the community? I think I've got 5 I'm going to talk about. The first is, as I hinted earlier, we were looking at national energy security, but not technological energy security. And I would maintain, as we say here, every single energy system, from a nuclear reactor to a smart meter, has different energy security risks, even light bulbs, right? Talking about end use and disposal. And we tried to preview these in a recent special issue of Nature Climate Change and Nature Energy. And again, the idea here is there's no such thing as risk-free or environmentally benign sources of energy. And of course, we can do this here with the fossil fuels, but it also exists for the low-carbon sources, right? Hydroelectric dams, you have emissions from reservoirs, you have forced relocation of communities, you have the risk of catastrophic failure. There was a really big dam failure in the 70s which killed 180,000 people in China. Solar and wind, you have issues about toxicity with materials, you have avian mortality for wind, you have extensive backup and integration costs. Nuclear, you have the entire life cycle of uranium mines, mills, fuel enrichment facilities, the back end of waste, the risk of serious catastrophic accidents, and even biofuel and efficiency has pros and cons. My beloved energy efficiency, which I love, and I say it's, energy efficiency is the answer. What's the question is my kind of joke as I talk to my students, because it's usually a least cost option of mitigation and environmental sustainability. But even it has pernicious trade-offs, as well as biofuels, which are more well known. Loss of jobs, displacement, difficulty in measuring, rebound effects, which my colleague Steve Sorrell talks about a lot. So again, getting a better sense for what these risks are, how they are defined, how they're constructed, how they're distributed. Nuclear is a great example because its risks are often distributed across time to future generations in ways that maybe wind and solar are not. And it's a just very, very brief kind of aside. We have done some work on nuclear risks with my colleagues at ETH Zurich, and we have found risks that are perhaps greater than you think. We've cataloged hundreds of nuclear events, incidents and accidents. We've quantified them. We've plotted how well they do on the International Nuclear Event Scale, as well as the NEMS, which is a scale that was proposed in a physics journal. And basically what you can see is, the short answer is, events are reducing in frequency but increasing in severity. And if you look forward, this figure is too complex, I told them, but they still did it. This is future nuclear accidents. What this basically said is that another Fukushima or Chernobyl is more probable than not in our lifetime. So we likely will see another accident as long as conventional reactors continue to operate. And we're in a current regime where they're trying to extend licenses, et cetera. And the scale of those accidents will likely be into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Both Fukushima and Chernobyl were more than $100 billion of damages. And this is not talking about cancer. This is more talking about things like lost product, depreciation of shares for TEPCO, remediation costs, litigation costs, evacuation costs, et cetera. I don't want to pick on nuclear. Wind energy also has different risks. So we just did what was called an environmental profit and loss of European wind turbines, monetized externalities, and found that, in fact, most of these wind turbines cost about 3 to 4 million euros. You lose up to a quarter of their value if you price out manufacturing externalities. And this is not externalities from operation or decommissioning. This is just building this stuff. And what's interesting there is a lot of it happens offshore, China and South Korea. So even European low-carbon wind energy, wind turbines being deployed in the UK, Denmark, and Norway, have hidden risks that spread across space and time. It's not just nuclear energy. So I think that first area of technological risks and energy security is one that we should certainly explore more. A second is moving away from technology to focus not on technologies but energy services. And so this is quite nice. This shows you the complexity of energy use for Bangladesh. And what I like is you can see all of the different energy sources of demand coupled to different kind of conversion processes from different sectors. And the complexity of arrows, look at non-residential heat, for instance, is illuminating. It implies that multiple technologies can provide a single service. And if you don't want to talk about Bangladesh, you want to talk about rich countries, this shows you for many OECD countries, including the UK, the most used energy services in our types of economies, and it's things like heating and water and cooking and lighting. And I guess you could have put mobility here if you're moving beyond households, talk about cars. So the idea here is we shift our discourse away from oil security and coal security to security of mobility, security of comfort, security of convenience. Because that's what we're really after, right? It's the energy service. It's not the technology or the fuel. And often we confuse means with ends. And if your focus is on mobility, for instance, maybe you want security of walking rather than security of petroleum. I think the third area is a lot of what I've talked about has been case studies and numbers, but it helps hide perhaps that there are very real human impacts, justice, social justice, equity impacts with our energy choices. And I think humanizing those and not forgetting that it's not just about models and projections, it's about life and suffering really matters. And this also helps illustrate trade-offs because this is a 9-year-old coal miner in India, but India needs to expand coal use to achieve universal energy access. So there's one core trade-off, youth and child labor versus affordability and universal access. Or pollution from Chinese coal-fired power plants, maybe offsetting up to 3% of China's GDP. Acid rain, particulate matter pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide. Right? This farmer loses, and that coal-fired power plant doesn't have to pay them. Or this shows you the thyroid cancer victims from Chernobyl. This guy is 9 years old, and again, nuclear power can provide baseload electricity, but when it malfunctions, we are left with pretty drastic consequences. Or this, is this fair? Is it fair we have a global energy system that sends the same amount of electricity to wealthy New Yorkers as it does to an entire continent? If we were to talk about justice and go behind John Rawls' veil of ignorance, not knowing how we would be born, whether we're the prince or the pauper, would we choose a society like this that could put us at risk of living here where populations have never even seen a light bulb or had a hot shower or checked email? The fourth area, and I'm wrapping up, Neil, I know I'm almost out of time, is how we talk about energy security. So energy security discourse, not as an object, but as a linguistic process. And I'm sorry, I know I'm here talking to a bunch of modelers, but discourses do matter, and it's much more than just rhetoric. It's how we frame and think. Thomas Kuhn used the term paradigm to refer to it. You can say worldview, you can use frame. And what we found in some work I did with a colleague at Harvard was that you can take the same type of project, like the Medupi coal-fired power plant in South Africa, and you can oppose it or support it on energy security grounds. Energy security is such a malleable term, it's kind of whatever you want it to be. Because the advocates who were pro-Medupi talked about the security of development and sustainability, and those who were against it talked about, no, it's inequitable development and degradation. And both of them used energy security frames. And I should also acknowledge, in case you haven't figured it out, I am a white male who's been privileged enough to have a PhD and work at one of the best universities in the UK, who has a certain view on things. When I research, I have certain assumptions and biases that I cannot separate out, right? And so it's kind of telling that here I am as a person who owns a car and a person who owns a house and a person who has a washing machine talking to you about energy security, whereas, you know, I'm not a member of an indigenous community, I'm not a member of the vulnerable, I'm not a member of the illiterate. And so the idea there is if you're serious about energy insecurities among vulnerable groups, we need different voices than my own, as much as I love to hear myself talk. And so here I think we want to talk about different narratives and how do different representations of energy security circulate power or hegemony. Who gets marginalized? Who loses? Even low carbon transitions, which we all want, will have serious losers. Who speaks? What counts as evidence? Right? These are all really interesting claims. I mean, I come from a community that talks about models as tools of persuasion rather than tools of power, right? So your solution is get your own model and then get your own number and walk into a debate. And so I think it's really interesting to talk about how energy security is both constructed and deconstructed among different groups. Oh, and I put this up here. This is from a classic scholar in rhetoric called E. Thomas Goodnight, who talked about different spheres of argument. And his argument was that we basically occupy three spheres. We have the personal sphere, when you're talking to your partner at night, when you're at a bar. You have the public sphere, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Nigel Farage, et cetera. And then you have the kind of intermediary sphere that ties the two together. And I think energy security is interesting because it seems to be a discourse that is certainly relegated probably to the public or government sphere. I don't think a lot of us have discussions late at night with our spouses about energy security, unless they're researching it, perhaps. But the idea here is that it may be a particular type of discourse that only occurs in certain places at certain times. And then finally, I think this is my last set of slides, talk about scale. And again, I looked at nations in my energy security work, but I think there's a lot more work to be done at different scales, especially scales below the nation, below the community. Household security, and there's been a lot of good work now coming out about things like fuel poverty. What are the lived experiences of fuel poverty? How do people experience heat? What does it mean to say that you're fuel poor? We did a study on Warmfront, which was a major UK-led, Britain-led, I should say, energy efficiency and retrofitting scheme, and found that a quarter of people didn't want to acknowledge they were fuel poor because it was stigmatized. Right? So they would actually not get help because in their mind, I'm not fuel poor, because they felt they would be seen as a victim. And so there are complex social dynamics at play. And again, fuel poverty is something that has gone significantly up. I mean, I should have probably graphed numbers that went beyond 2012. And then we have this whole access about global energy systems and how inequitable that is. And so even using 2016 data, can you believe we still have roughly 1 in 5 people without any access to electricity? Or cooking, that we actually have a far greater, almost 40% of people are still cooking over fires or with lumps of dung. There's no microwave, there's no gas range, there's no microwave popcorn. Break my heart, because I love microwave popcorn. And this creates extremely serious health issues. If you want a really depressing read, The Lancet publishes every now and then the Global Burden of Disease study. This is basically a study of how humanity dies. And if you have really sharp eyes, you can see here household air pollution from solid fuels, basically how people cook, is 4th on the list. 4 million deaths a year. 3.5 million direct and 500,000 indirect. 4 million deaths a year. I think I worked it out. That's 11 deaths a minute. While I'm talking, dozens of people have died because of how they cook. So this is a much more serious health issue than malaria, tuberculosis, maybe even HIV/AIDS, yet most of us never talk about it, right? In some parts of the world, like South Asia, pollution from cooking is number 1 across all risk factors. Same with Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because this is the global average, doesn't show you differences. It's also for both sexes as well in India. It's not just women and children who are dying, it's also men. So I think this discussion about households and how we use energy in the home as consumers or prosumers is a really important one, as well as the inequity and poverty. So my last slide. I think this means, despite my research project providing some answers, it's probably raised more questions than answers. I still think energy security is a really interesting point of discussion. I know Neil said that people have kind of moved away from it a bit, but I do think there's a lot of value there. I think that our research does underscore how it is multidimensional as a topic. It cuts across a lot of these binaries we've constructed, the biggest one of which is supply and demand. Another one is importer and exporter. In our studies, we found a lot of countries are doing both at the same time. Even major exporters like Russia, Denmark, and Saudi Arabia are still interdependent and import lots of things. Russia's importing electricity. Saudi Arabia is importing refined diesel fuel. Denmark is actually importing trash from the UK, as it would have it, to run with some of their waste energy facilities. What is security and insecurity is very relative, and there's no such thing as absolute things. I could tell you that Denmark is energy secure, but then maybe people in Denmark view themselves as insecure. As well as notions of independence, interdependence, fossil fuels, renewables, all of it can be encapsulated under this notion of energy security. That said, I stand by the fact that I think we need a lot more dynamic, inclusive, and holistic accounts of what energy security is. Dynamic, the research that I presented provided snapshots, 1970, 2007, 1990, 1995, right? Not very dynamic. It was not the most inclusive. My interviews and surveys were elite. The idea was like a Delphi survey, go to the experts, go to the Oracle, talk to the professors at UCL, but don't talk to the actual consumers, right? And finally, we weren't that holistic. Yes, we sketched 320 indicators and 5 energy security dimensions. Maybe there are more. Maybe there are less. Does climate change belong there? Does water belong there? These were extremely contentious points during some of the workshops that we hosted. And I think we need a lot more mixing of quantitative and qualitative approaches that help get us really good analysis that is a lot more representative and maybe commensurate to the energy security challenges we face. And with that, here's my contact details. Thank you for listening. I'm exactly on time. How did I do that?
You are exactly on time. Benjamin, thank you so much. You've answered some questions and posed some more questions. We'd now like to open it up for questions. If I would ask you to tell us who you are and please ask a question. Don't just make your own mini presentation. Do we have any questions from the floor? Please.
Jürgen Huber, Voice Collection. Just wondered if you took into account affordability when you talk about affordability, disposable incomes in different countries?
Yeah, I think we looked at the prices of petrol and electricity adjusted for power purchasing parity. So in that sense, we didn't take currencies at face value. We did normalize for understanding what a basket of goods would cost, but that's as far as we went in terms of looking at household incomes. We didn't look at fuel poverty as part of the index, although we could have, because when we were doing the study, even though we had the EU and the US in there, it was really Asian focused. And their energy poverty, lack of access, is a much more serious concern than fuel poverty for the moment. Fuel poverty seems acute in industrialized countries. Lack of access seems acute in developing countries. But I would agree that'd be another great area to look at.
Yeah, I'm Paul Eakins from UCL Institute of Sustainable.
And you sat in the front. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Benjamin. I've also got a question about affordability. And it sounds as if in your calculations of affordability, you're including taxation. Now, I would think that you could make a case that would say, if Denmark, for example, which was right up at the top end of your lack of affordability, if it wasn't taxing energy for a similar public finance position, it would have to tax something else. And so I would think it's a bit misleading to include taxation under the affordability thing, unless you're saying Denmark would have taxed something that had less. You need to look at the revenue side of taxation, is what I'm saying. And I'm just wondering, you will have thought about that, because you will know that literature. And I wondered how you kind of dealt with that.
Yeah, we were really after more affordability from a consumer standpoint at the retail end. So it's kind of, what does the consumer have to pay? So it would accommodate all subsidies, all taxes, et cetera, for those two things, electricity and petrol. It actually would have been gasoline or diesel. And so that's as far as we got in the discussion. We didn't even think about taxation and reinvestment and things like that.
But I mean, if Denmark had increased VAT and reduced its taxes on fuels,
you're right,
then disposable income implications would have been very similar.
Yes.
But affordability of fuels would have seemed to be much better.
I completely agree, and I would be happy to send you our full data set And we could normalize maybe these tax issues, and we can have another Paul Ekins-led study in nature, perhaps. No, I don't mean to marginalize your comment. You're right. But we were more focusing, our aim was to underscore an element of what consumers have to spend in each country that you can compare across countries. And so we kind of took the easy way out.
Please, we'll go right to the back.
Hi, Mark. Sorry. I was just wondering if, part of your research, if you considered, in terms of affordability, the appetite for finance from major banks, from governments, given A, these projects are very expensive, and B, they're obviously, the leading banks, for example, have lots of limitations on what they would like to finance, both from a societal or environmental impact.
No, is the short answer. We did not look at that type of financing. We looked at subsidies per capita, but again, we also didn't adjust or normalize. It was more you take the amount of reported subsidies, divide it by the population to get a sense of who's intervening in the marketplace more. I should say, while this energy security index and project was a core part of the grant, it was not the only one. There was another one all about energy access and investment and business models. So that one got a lot more into things like energy service companies, project finance, things like at that time the CDM was going quite strong. Tradable carbon credits were getting about 25 euros per ton, which has completely collapsed, I think. So that whole project was looking at those across Asian markets. So that kind of gets a little more in your direction of what financiers think. I can also say that two of the people that we had at our workshop were experts in this, one of which I think is still in Europe, and his name is Rolf Wusterhagen at the University of St. Gallen. He's very good at investor perceptions, does a lot of discrete choice experiments and other types of work with venture capitalists and with other kind of those types of financiers to see what they think about different trends, wind, low carbon, et cetera. And so his work was very good. And he did push for some of the stuff to be more about finance. But we didn't want to bias the index any too much in favor of any single dimension. That's why we have, 5 dimensions and 20 components. We could have had more or less, but I think we reached a good balance.
Okay, so you're not working hard enough, so we're going to do multiple. Okay, so
Okay.
Gentleman in pink, Novel behind, and this lady here. So we'll go 1, 2, 3.
Hi, yeah, it's Donald Brown from Scroop. My question relates to the kind of temporal dimension that you used. You discussed kind of resource depletion.
Yeah.
Probably, I just kind of wonder what timescales, how immediate was that consideration? Obviously, if you think about fossil fuels long term, obviously their exportability is an inevitability. So, over what timescale was it people's personal subjectivity about when things were going to run out?
Reserve to production ratios.
Okay.
There's a very easy answer.
But hold that one, we'll do 3.
I should write them down then. Oh, I can remember.
Yeah, so mine is a bit broader in the sense that, so you come up with another index for energy security that that is more comprehensive, etc. Then what does it mean for policymakers? So what does it mean that who is energy security's role to fix? Is it the energy ministry, or we're talking now, we're including water, we're including environment?
Yeah.
Whose decision is it then? Yeah, if you could elaborate.
So that's 2 to hold, please.
Cara Jenkinson, you may have covered it within the indicators, but to what extent did you look at the vulnerability of security in each country to climate change? I.e., if we didn't hit the 2 degrees, what's the risk?
Yep. I'll start with that, and then I'll work backwards. How's that? Yes, we tried to have one indicator on resilience, but it wasn't the best indicator. Our idea initially was to have indicators for mitigation and adaptation, but then we ran into this tricky problem of how do you measure resilience, especially in these countries that we were looking at starting in 1990, because we had to have data going all the way back, because one of our principles was availability of data, which also gets into Donald's question. We just used reserve to production ratios as a kind of proxy, which also have a whole ton of problems, as you know. But I do think, the climate change issue probably is getting much more important now. When we did this study, this was pre-Copenhagen. We were really hopeful. And I think everyone there was talking it'll be 1.5 degrees or lower temperature change. Whereas now I think we're all thinking 4, possibly 5 degrees, depending on which projections you look at. Notwithstanding the new IPCC report on 1.5, but I think that's more of a kind of lofty intention rather than an achievable reality. And one of the things we already did start to see in some of our analysis was climate change itself is interfering with a lot of these energy systems' ability to work, especially the renewables, forecasting for wind, cloud cover for solar, precipitation patterns, and all of that. Water availability is all shifting really dramatically, especially in places like South Asia. which have the Himalayas and get a lot of their water from places like Nepal and elsewhere. So yes, it's point taken. I wish we'd done a better job capturing it. And if you do know of ways to measure resilience on an index like this, with readily available data, then write to me or talk to me, and we'd love to look at it, because we're still doing other work on resilience. Question back there kind of about energy falling across different domains and ministries, agriculture, health, transport, electricity. Yes. And I can say the first area in which this gets to be an issue is data collection. Because we would go to certain ministries in Laos, like they had a ministry of fuel and petroleum, and they would say, oh, we don't have that, go to this ministry. And they say, oh, no, the Ministry of Petroleum has it, and no one has it. And so I think already, just for trying to get simple answers like how much oil do you consume per year, or what's the retail cost of kilowatt hour of electricity, were somewhat difficult to answer. But I think there's a more substantive question there, and that is, if it's true that energy security is all of these things, whose responsibility is it? Do we need a Ministry of Energy Security? Probably not. I mean, there was back when I was doing the study, there was also talk of creating a global energy council like the WTO. Any of you remember this discussion back in the 90s? The idea was, much like the WTO, World Trade Organization, we need a single energy organization with the authority to regulate, or at least arbitrate. The IEA doesn't really do it because they're only OECD countries, and they're really more about oil stockpiles and maybe data sharing. So we kind of go beyond. But that was kind of laughable. We already have enough fear of the UN and the US at least overstepping its bounds. Can you imagine a global energy group that controls, and would OPEC ever concede authority? No. So while there might be much said for centralization, I think we'll probably have to confront this notion that energy remains multisectoral and very complex and cuts across multiple ministries. I know my colleagues at SPRU have done these nice trees, these kind of visual diagrams of policy making for energy in the UK, and it's like 25 constituent ministries and departments. And now that DEC is gone and we've reshuffled, it might even be more or less, I'm not sure. In the US, it's even worse. It's 17 actual ministries or departments across 88 different divisions. And even some like nuclear are split. The NRC regulates nuclear, the DOE promotes nuclear. So it's, I don't have an answer to you in terms of how we get, if it is this complex, I think we have to acknowledge that complexity and work across different ministries, but I probably suspect we won't be able to change the structure of those ministries. There have been a few cases actually now that come to mind in some of our case study countries where they did create a single ministry for energy. So I think it's the Sustainable Energy Authority of Sri Lanka was one, and there was another one of our case studies that had one, but they come and go. They were created and then disbanded a few years later. So even when you try to create a unified ministry for all of energy, first of all, it's only energy, not transport, and then they usually don't exist for very long.
Did you have your temporal question answered?
He does. It was just a number on reserve to production ratios from the EIA's database, Energy Information Administration. And remember, we were looking from 1990 to 2010, so 1990 would have been the baseline. We were looking at changes within those reserve to production ratios. Crude, but at least illustrative, we thought.
So we'll do a last round of questions. I see Alec at the back. I think Alec, you have the only question. So we'll ask. No.
She does now.
So we have two questions as you harangue this poor person to ask a question. So Alec, please ask your question and then we'll have this other.
I was interested that this is like a dilemma in many ways, that you can't achieve the best outcome on all of the dimensions at the same time. I was wondering what your thoughts were about how you might consider what might be the best outcome, and how you might go about thinking about how you design more cost policies that would actually achieve a better outcome collectively than some other set of ways of tackling it.
Sorry.
You said I'm going in groups, and then you asked me to.
Terrible cheating. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks. My name is Alessandra Tiso, I'm a student, and I wanted to ask a very simple, straightforward question about how did you treat conflict, either within the country or geopolitically.
Yeah.
So if Ukraine and Russia have a problem, or within Nigeria, is this reflected in the way you treat security?
No, that's a great question. It's not reflected in the index at all. We had trade and imports and dependence as different components, but we did not actually have one that would say conflict or number of conflicts. That said, in one of our outputs from the project, that Rutledge Handbook of Energy Security, we talk a lot about trade and geopolitics. And there you have people talking about transit countries, importing countries, exporting countries, the complexity of issues, governance mechanisms like the Energy Charter Treaty, which are designed to minimize and create a platform for arbitration. We I think have this really fun table about the number of geopolitical events related to energy, and it's like 110. It's not just Ukraine and Russia, it's Russia and Belarus, Russia and Germany, and it's not just Russia. I mean, it's Israel cutting off electricity for the Palestinians, and it's, a whole bunch of other things that happen. And so it's a good point, but it's not reflected in the index, but it is in some of the other outputs. How do you create truly energy secure, optimal energy policies is a fantastic question. And a colleague of mine has created a report that I quite like, and I've cited a few times, and it's free, and it's got a great title, which I hope I get. It's called, I think, Risk-Aware Electricity Policy. And the guy who wrote it, his name is Ronald Binz, B-I-N-Z. I like that because what that does is it takes, for at least electricity, your traditional metric right now, which is used a lot, is levelized cost of energy. And at least that's better than capital cost, because levelized cost is like capital cost minus depreciation with discount rates and all of that. So, and you might even tax on some externalities as well. And he looks at, if you were to rank for the US LCOE, here's your priorities. It's gas and coal and nuclear and wind maybe, and then solar's at the bottom or things like that. But then he says, okay, let's broaden the discussion to talk about risk. And he talks only about 5 or 6 different types of risk. All of them are in our index, but our index is a little bit bigger. But he's talking about, I think, construction cost overruns, accidents and reliability issues, labor strikes, climate and carbon emissions were one. So he kind of expands it, has a nice discussion, and then presents you at the end with the risk-aware ranking of options, and it's completely the opposite of the first one. So his idea is if you do start to try to at least accommodate different risks, even if you just sketch them out a little bit and use really conservative numbers. I mean, he was talking about prices of carbon that were really low, and he was talking about, kind of conservative takes on all of those things. Now, all of your fossil fuels are at the bottom, nuclear is right above it, and then all your renewables and efficiency are at the top. So while you can disagree with his method and how he did it, I think it's illustrative in the notion if we do start to broaden the discussion to talk about other things, pollution, water, conflict, etc., they all are out there. At least that discussion itself might have value in spotlighting areas we don't talk about or we neglect. And then we at least create more aware, even if not perfect, more aware, informed energy planning and policymaking. But I think Binz was provocative enough to be a good start, and no one has done it for the UK, for instance. So maybe that could be what someone in the room does going forward.
Great. We have unfortunately come to the end of our seminar time.